when Private Kinsley Rhodes first reported to Joint Base Raven Rock, a critical but mostly unknown intelligence and communications node tucked away in the arid silence of the Arizona desert. The reputation that preceded her was not one of exceptional skill or grit, but of an unfortunate nickname, Barbie. Take a look at the boot camp footage, the perfectly coiffed blonde hair, the immaculate, if slightly ill-fitting uniform, the struggle with the 70-pound ruck march that had earned her the moniker from a particularly cynical drill sergeant. Her physical performance reports were middling, and while the military valued every soldier, the airmen at Raven Rock, tasked with monitoring some of the most sensitive satellite communications in the entire Pacific Theater, were generally expected to have the cold, analytical demeanor of professional operators, not the apparent vulnerability of someone who looked like they should be modeling. Rhodes, however, possessed an asset invisible to the judgmental eye, a mind trained not in raw physical endurance, but in the labyrinthine intricacies of electronic warfare and proprietary network architecture, a deep-dive specialization she had chosen and excelled at, even if the subsequent physical training had been a mismatch. Her assignment to the Network Operations Center NOC was seen by the veterans as a low-risk posting, a place where the pretty ones could push papers and make coffee without tripping over anything important. This judgment, this fundamental underestimation, was a slow-burning fuse, a dramatic juxtaposition to the high-stakes environment they all inhabited. She spent her first few weeks in a state of quiet, almost suffocating boredom, observing the mundane rituals of the shift change, the endless rhythmic blinking of the server racks and the dismissive glances of her senior NCOs, all of them convinced they knew exactly who Private Rhodes was, and more importantly, what she was capable of. The very air of Raven Rock, usually a steady and controlled, technological calm, was about to be shattered by an event none of the real operators saw coming, an event that would require a different kind of strength than they had ever trained for, and a skill set that only the private they called Barbie possessed. In the cold, sterile heart of the NOC, where the temperature was always kept near freezing for the health of the processors, Kinsley Rhodes was running her assigned duties, which mostly involved data integrity checks and logging routine status updates, work that required patience but little actual cognitive effort. It was 17 hours on a Tuesday, one of those deep night shifts where the world outside seemed to cease to exist, and only the hum of the cooling fans provided a sense of reality. The shift supervisor, Master Sergeant Farrell, was slumped in his ergonomic chair, nursing a cold coffee and scrolling through old training slides, completely unaware that the subtle electronic background noise of the base was about to change. Kinsley, however, wasn't just checking boxes. She was running a parallel diagnostic script she had built herself during her initial weeks, a piece of code that monitored for deviations not in volume of traffic, but in the pattern and timing of the lowest-level command packets, something no standard commercial firewall would flag. This was part of her advanced training, the kind of deep protocol analysis that made eyes glaze over in briefings. Then the script pinged, an infinitesimally small data burst, originating from outside the known telemetry grid, a tiny electronic whisper that was immediately overwritten by normal traffic. Kinsley pulled the log, a fraction of a second of data, and stared at the signature. It was a perfectly formed, non-standard handshake sequence, the digital equivalent of a secret knock on the back door of the base's proprietary network kernel, the very core operating system that controlled everything from the HVAC to the satellite antennae positioning. She brought the anomaly to Farrell, pointing to the line of code that screamed intrusion attempt, but Farrell merely waved his hand. Rhodes, that's noise. Environmental feedback. We run a classified system, nothing gets past the outer layers. Go rerun your integrity check. His tone was dismissive, condescending, and final. He was a master of procedure, not innovation, and his judgment was blinded by the belief that the base's security perimeter was impenetrable. But Kinsley knew the truth. What she had seen wasn't noise, it was a probe, and the fact that it was so small and so expertly disguised meant the threat was not amateur. It was highly coordinated and highly lethal. She sat back down, the image of that alien code sequence burned into her mind, knowing the next time it appeared, it wouldn't be a probe, it would be the start of the attack. Exactly 47 minutes later, at 0284 hours, the Enochi erupted, not with a whimper, but with an earth-shattering electronic scream. The primary console screens, moments before glowing with calm, reassuring green data, all flashed to a violent strobing red, displaying a single chilling message: system lockout, access denied. Simultaneously, the base's external alarm, a siren usually reserved for drills, began its full wailing pitch, coupled with the heavy rhythmic thud of automated blast doors slamming shut across the complex. On the Enochi's secondary monitoring screen, a visual schematic of the base perimeter flickered to life, showing multiple high-velocity inbound contacts, not jets but drone swarms, low-flying and highly maneuverable, heading directly for the antenna fields and the subterranean server intake vents. Commander Hayes, the shift officer, screamed for a manual override, slamming his palm repeatedly onto the emergency disconnect panel, but the system didn't respond. The lockout wasn't just a notification, it was a total digital paralysis, the attack having immediately leveraged Kinsley's detected handshake to seize control of the kernel, locking out all authorized personnel. The entire control room, usually a hub of focused action, dissolved into panicked shouted commands, and the desperate sound of fingers hammering unresponsive keyboards. Master Sergeant Farrell, his face pale, frantically tried to establish a hardline connection to the command center, only to find the dedicated copper lines had also been remotely severed. This wasn't a standard cyber attack. This was electronic warfare designed to create maximum confusion, timing the digital breach precisely with the kinetic physical assault. They were blind, deaf, and rapidly approaching defenseless. Kinsley, amidst the chaos, remained strangely calm. She didn't panic because she had already seen the ghost in the machine. She didn't shout for a protocol because she knew the protocols were the target. While everyone else was focused on the locked-out front door, she was already thinking about the escape hatch, the one detailed in the obscure 300-page emergency digital isolation procedures manual that only she had taken the time to read during her specialization phase. Her fingers, which had often fumbled with rifle components in boot camp, were now moving with confident, almost terrifying precision toward the single, unmarked diagnostic port hidden beneath Farrell's desk. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and fear, but Kinsley Rhodes was moving with a singular, detached focus. Commander Hayes, his voice hoarse, was ordering an impossible physical counter-assault, a clear sign that the situation had moved beyond the established chain of command and into sheer desperation. Kinsley, ignoring the shouted warnings to stand down and follow orders, pulled a small, custom-made diagnostic thumb drive from her uniform pocket, a tool issued only to the deep-dive specialists in her cyber training, and which she'd been told to discard as it was too niche for a communications posting. She knelt by the desk, a blur of movement that sharply contrasted with the inertia of the senior officers, and plugged the drive directly into the hidden diagnostic port, bypassing the main network firewall entirely. This required a level of authorized yet technically unsanctioned access that was deeply forbidden under normal operating conditions. She then began typing short, snappy commands that were visible only on the tiny LED screen of her laptop. She was not attempting to regain control, she was attempting to isolate the system. Her analysis was instantaneous and damning. The malware was not simply an override, it was a highly sophisticated zero-day worm, specifically designed to encrypt and destroy the base's primary satellite encryption keys, rendering every communication channel useless, and making the base effectively invisible to friendly forces. The drone swarm outside was merely a distraction, the sound of their proximity growing louder, the final step in a meticulously planned blackout. The key to her countermeasure lay in a forgotten, rarely tested protocol called the Phoenix Gambit, designed to crash the operating system's kernel in a controlled manner, sacrificing local data to save the master encryption keys by isolating them on a separate hardwired chip, a procedure that had a 30% chance of bricking the entire system permanently. As the sweat dripped from her forehead onto the glowing keys, she typed the command sequence, the language of the kernel flowing through her mind like a native tongue. She was banking everything on the one theoretical procedure that her entire unit had laughed off as overkill during training, the deep knowledge of the digital anatomy of Raven Rock that no one else in that panicked room possessed. The critical phase began. Kinsley had executed the first isolation command, but the zero-day worm was adapting faster than predicted, its counter-response beginning to shred the firewall she had temporarily erected. On her tiny screen a timer appeared, 30 seconds until catastrophic key corruption. The stakes were immense. Losing those keys meant weeks of intelligence loss and a massive security vulnerability across the entire theater. Commander Hayes, finally seeing the lines of code on her laptop that indicated she was engaged in a genuine counter-hack, stopped shouting and moved to her side, his panic replaced by a chilling realization of the depth of the threat. Outside, the sound of the drone swarm transitioned from a buzz to a deafening roar, signaling their imminent arrival at the facility's surface vents. Kinsley was now fighting two simultaneous clocks, the internal digital timer and the external kinetic attack. She needed to execute the final, most dangerous phase of the Phoenix Gambit, a command that required precise timing to catch the encryption keys during a microsecond fluctuation in the system's voltage, a phenomenon she had studied meticulously but had never practiced outside of a simulation. She repeated the final complex sequence in her mind, her breath hitching as the timer dropped to 10 seconds. The lights in the NOC flickered violently, a sign that the physical intrusion team outside was successfully degrading the external power grid. 5 seconds. Farrell was breathing heavily, his eyes glued to the small screen. Kinsley had to initiate the controlled crash, forcing the kernel to write the keys to the isolated chip before the worm could execute its final corruption command. 3 seconds. She saw the micro-fluctuation hit the optimal voltage, a perfect opportunity, but the smallest hesitation would mean failure. Her hand hovered over the final key, the weight of the base, the security of the entire network resting on her singular, split-second decision. 1 second. She didn't think, she reacted, slamming her finger down on the enter key, executing the Phoenix command, and plunging the main console screen into absolute immediate darkness. For a long, agonizing beat of dead air, there was nothing, no wailing sirens, no humming servers, and no angry red lights, just the heavy, stunned silence of the NOC and the distant, fading echo of the drone roar outside. Then, slowly, almost tentatively, the main console screen blinked back to life, not red, but a reassuring, deep, military green. The system lockout message was gone, replaced by a simple line: Phoenix Gambit success, NICL integrity restored, encryption keys isolated. The base's external perimeter alarms ceased their wailing, the low-flying drone contacts on the secondary screen disappearing one by one, their electronic brains suddenly disconnected and falling inert to the desert sand. Kinsley pulled her thumb drive and calmly closed her laptop, the silence in the room punctuated only by the heavy breathing of the senior officers. Commander Hayes didn't shout, didn't demand a report. He simply stared at the single junior private, the one they called Barbie, whose unassuming appearance had masked the most critical skill set in the room. Her calculated, instantaneous decision to risk a system crash had saved the military's most valuable intelligence asset, neutralizing the coordinated attack and leaving the perpetrators with nothing but a handful of inert, downed drones. The subsequent official report, highly classified and distributed only to the highest levels, detailed the technical brilliance of Private Rhodes's countermeasure, a procedure that would later be taught in specialized schools across the globe. Back in the barracks the next morning, Private Rhodes was quiet as ever, still navigating the small indignities of base life. The nickname, however, had changed. No one used Barbie anymore, at least not dismissively. They used it with a strange, grudging respect, a quiet acknowledgement that on the night the alarms went off, the girl they had written off as a paper pusher had proven that sometimes the most effective weapon against a modern threat is not brute force, but a lightning-fast mind, and the ability to see the one essential weakness in a system everyone else assumed was perfect.